Heidi, welcome.
Awesome, thank you. And Lori, did you also want to make an announcement, share Inside Out
I'm
information?
I'm good.
Okay, okay, good. I just want to make sure. All right. So I'm going to go ahead and share PowerPoint with you all, and you can let me know if it's showing up correctly before we jump into it. All right. So now you should all be seeing the first slide of my PowerPoint, but not seeing my notes. Is that correct? Awesome. And you guys can all hear me well? All right, great. Thanks. All right, so good afternoon. My name's Heidi Reynolds-Stenson. I'm an associate professor of sociology and criminology at Colorado State University Pueblo. And I've been an instructor with Inside Out for about 3 years now, teaching at a women's prison here in Pueblo. I've been teaching a class called Understanding Lived Experiences, where we read memoirs and talk about those through a sociological lens, as well as write and share our own personal experiences through that same sociological lens. It's been a class I've really enjoyed teaching. I've also really enjoyed connecting with this community of passionate, engaged, inside out instructors and hearing about all of the interesting and meaningful work you all are doing as teachers, as scholars. And so I really want to thank Lori for putting together this talk series and all of you for being here and giving me this opportunity to share with you some of my work that I hope you will all find interesting and also relevant in the political moment that we find ourselves in now. So I'll be presenting some of the findings from my first book published a couple years ago entitled Cultures of Resistance, Collective Action and Rationality in the Anti-Terror Age. In this talk, I'm really only going to be able to hit on some of the highlights of the book, but there'll also be time during Q&A so we can go into greater detail about those parts that you all are most interested in. So when people join together in protest, and especially when this protest threatens public order or the status quo, governments often respond by trying to suppress those expressions of dissent and restore order. We can see this throughout history and still today across a range of countries, not just in authoritarian regimes, but also in democracies, such as the United States. And this state repression, as social movement scholars refer to it, can come in a variety of forms. Sometimes it's overt and out in the open, like riot police using rubber bullets or tear gas on protesters, or protesters being arrested, sometimes hundreds at a time, to clear the streets. Sometimes it's harder to see, like tapped phones, social media surveillance, or undercover officers sent to get information, intimidate, or stir up interpersonal drama in organizations. But regardless of the type of repression, a huge unsettled question in social movements research is how state repression impacts subsequent protest, whether it has a chilling deterrent effect on protest or whether it backfires and spurs even more mobilization. Some argue that repression should have a deterrent effect on protests because it increases the costs of participation. And according to this logic, an individual may decide not to participate in protest after experiencing the legal, physical, or other costs of repression, what criminologists would understand as specific deterrents, or others might be dissuaded from becoming involved in protest because they see others experiencing these consequences and want to avoid them for themselves, which could be understood as general deterrents. And others argue that maybe repression actually leads to greater mobilization by reinforcing boundaries between activists and opponents, confirming activists' sense that the state or other targets are in need of reform or revolution, or by provoking emotions such as outrage that can motivate mobilization. This backfire effect could affect those that are already involved. For example, individuals may double down on their convictions and commitment after experiencing state repression. Or new participants may be drawn in because they're angered by the state's repression of a movement that they are sympathetic to. So empirical work on this question has not brought consensus, with many studies finding deterrent effects and many other studies finding evidence of backfire. So the task has really become teasing out when repression tends to have one effect rather than the other. In other words, identifying contingent factors that may act as a switchman in the relationship between repression and mobilization. And so research has examined various contingent factors, such as the form of repression, for example, legal versus violent repression, or the timing of repression within a movement cycle. And my book contributes to this debate by examining how the activists individually and collectively understand the risks of repression and work to mitigate them. By examining how the groups that activists are embedded in can shape the costs and benefits of repression and participation, I help to resolve some of the mixed findings on repression effects in previous literature. So my primary data source was in-depth interviews with 45 activists in Arizona who had experienced various forms of state repression. I started with a law enforcement watch list that was made public through a Freedom of Information Act request as my seed sample. It's unclear exactly how individuals ended up on this watch list, but many had been arrested at a protest at some point. Others had had contact with someone who was later discovered to be an undercover officer and suspect that that was how they ended up on the list. I interviewed as many of those on the watch list as possible and asked these respondents to identify others that I could speak with or who had had similar kinds of experiences, resulting in a snowball sample of 45 respondents from this hard-to-reach population. The people I interviewed served months or even years in prison, had their heads slammed into street curbs and cell walls by police, and were pepper sprayed and shot with rubber bullets. Others woke up to surveillance vans outside their homes for days on end, had their homes raided, were questioned by the FBI, or discovered that trusted friends had worn bugs at the behest of law enforcement. Not all had experiences this extreme, but everyone I spoke with incurred significant costs as a result of their political activity. They came from a variety of different organizations and causes, as well as levels and duration of political involvement. It's important to note that all were leftists, and many, but certainly not all, were fairly radical, and sometimes their more radical politics or more confrontational tactics were part of why they were on the watch list or known to others on the watch list. So the point is that they're not representative of activists more generally, but rather of activists who have been targeted for monitoring and have experienced state repression. I also attended dozens of activist trainings, meetings, group discussions that were focused on preparing for and responding to state repression. Spent hundreds of hours working as a legal observer at protests and saw firsthand the ways that activists provide support to one another in the face of repression and how they respond in the moment when faced with these risks. I observed at protests all around Arizona on a variety of issues, ranging in size from 15 people to over 5,000. At most of these protests, the police were either not present or they were present but didn't intervene. But I was also at some protests where arrests were made and force was used on the crowd. I also analyzed activist written materials, pamphlets, or zines that were suggested by my interview respondents as helping to inform how they thought about the risks of repression and ways to resist it. I analyzed about 70 such documents, totaling over 1,600 pages. I coded these using themes emergent from the interviews, focusing on how activists give meaning to repression, weigh risks of repression, and respond emotionally and strategically to repression. I collected all these data between 2014 and 2017, a period in which post-9/11 changes in the repression of dissent in the United States had fully taken hold, and activists and movement organizations had been grappling with how to respond to these changes for quite some time. After September 11th, heightened concerns about national security and domestic terrorism had led to a series of legislation, the Patriot Act, Homeland Security Act, Intelligence Reform and Terrorism Prevention Act, and the Animal Enterprise Terrorism Act. Together, these laws relaxed privacy protections, legally redefined some acts of protest as terrorism that carried much stricter penalties, and allotted billions of dollars for new infrastructure and jobs to track potential domestic terrorism threats. And so during this period, 70 fusion centers were created across the country to increase intelligence sharing between federal and local agencies for this purpose. And 20 years later, this infrastructure and the law enforcement positions largely remain and have been bolstered by the development of increasingly advanced surveillance technology. So well motivated by concerns about terrorism, this apparatus of the state has in practice often been used to monitor U.S. activists. And it was within this context that in 2005, the FBI labeled animal rights and environmental activists as the #1 domestic terrorism threat to the U.S. And this paved the way for the prosecution and long-term imprisonment of several activists from these movements, leaving the organizations and communities they were a part of in shock. All of this set the stage for and directly shaped the experiences and perceptions of those that I studied, and is reflective of a broader shift in the policing of dissent in the United States over the last 20 years towards what some scholars have called strategic incapacitation. Strategic incapacitation is characterized, among other things, by extensive and real-time surveillance, information sharing across law enforcement agencies, and extensive and proactive control of public space. So in Arizona, where I conducted my study, the Arizona Fusion Center employed more than 800 terrorism liaison officers who worked throughout the state. A 2013 FOIA request revealed that millions of dollars had been spent in Arizona to monitor Occupy Phoenix, Occupy Tucson, immigrant rights advocacy groups, and others. And the documents also revealed that the Fusion Center had engaged in electronic surveillance of activists and used undercover officers embedded in activist groups in Arizona. And Arizona is not unique in this, but rather is a microcosm of what had been occurring in the US as a whole, and which has continued despite concerns raised by many, including a US Senate committee, that fusion centers have failed to uncover evidence of domestic terrorism and instead infringed on First Amendment rights of US citizens. So in all, about 3/4 of those that I interviewed maintained or increased their involvement over time, despite their experiences of state repression, which, as I mentioned before, were sometimes quite severe. But there were others, about 1/4 of my sample, that were effectively deterred by these experiences to the point of completely disengaging from activism and avoiding situations like protests that might put them at further risk. So to illustrate this sort of variety of different responses to repression, I'm going to read a few short passages from my book that reflect these divergent responses. Note that all the names that I use now and throughout the presentation and book are pseudonyms, and some details are intentionally obscured to protect the identity of respondents. All right. So Corey was a self-described sheltered white middle-class college student studying political science when he decided to check out the Occupy protests in his city, mostly out of curiosity more than anything else. He had never been involved in protest before, and the entire experience was transformative for him. From discussing political philosophy with people from very different walks of life and positions on the left half of the political spectrum, to being arrested in an attempt by police to clear the park on the first day that he joined the occupation. Jail was an especially illuminating experience for him, an opportunity to see what those with less privilege than he had experienced, and the way poor and working class people became entangled in the dragnet of the criminal justice system. He explained that before this, I'd never had to actually go sit inside of a jail for 18 hours and see what the rest of the country goes through, because it's not something that I go through. It's not a world that I'm shown very often. And so I think it was an incredibly eye-opening experience, and it really changed my view of how the justice system works, and it doesn't. Once you're on the other side, inside the jail, you literally have no agency. You have no rights. After he was released from the jail, he went directly back to the encampment and continued to be involved for weeks until the protests eventually died out, along with other Occupy encampments across the country. He credited his arrest on that first day with fueling this newfound dedication to the cause. He explained, "I don't think I would have gone past that first day had I not been arrested. I think that really opened my eyes to a bunch of different injustices that I didn't really know about. It just pissed me off, basically." He added, "All the police wanted to do was show a show of force, which they did. What they didn't realize is that we were getting a lot out of it too, that the experience itself was radicalizing us." Angela, a nun who spent several months in prison for participating in an anti-nuclear civil disobedience action, echoed a similar sentiment. She told me, "The time I grew the most was when I was sent to the women's prison. And I feel very, very proud to not have only gone through that experience, but that I met and now know some wonderful people that I never would have known, people in my life that I never would have met. They made me aware of so much. At one point, she was transferred on a plane to another prison across the country, along with several other inmates. She was surprised to find out that almost none of the other inmates had ever been on an airplane before, and many were terrified. To her, the idea that these women were flying on a plane for the first time in their lives and were doing so under these circumstances, their feet and hands shackled together and their waists shackled together to one another for the entire cross-country flight, so that it became a sizable feat of collective action every time one of them needed to use the restroom, was a tragedy and a reminder of the profoundly limited opportunities they'd had in their lives. She was struck by how young and poor her fellow inmates were, and by the fact that so many of them were serving time for nonviolent drug crimes, and years later, she still can't forget them. Her time in prison, despite the discomfort, humiliation, and fallout with her family that resulted, ultimately served to deepen her commitment to social justice and strengthen her critique of inequality and injustice. And on the other hand, Gerald, who spent years in prison on terrorism charges, told me with tears in his eyes that he wished he could still be involved, but just can't. His son died unexpectedly while he was incarcerated. His criminal record has made it difficult for him to find work, and his life has been forever changed. I've already lost too much, he told me. Emily also found the weight of what she had lost to be too much to bear. In her early 30s, at the time I spoke with her, she told me of how she gave her entire 20s to activism, living on nothing and in constant fear of the state, as she saw friends go to prison or kill themselves to avoid it. Now she just wanted some peace and security. She even moved to a new town because she felt as if everyone in her old town knew that she was involved in the circle of people that had been swept up in a crackdown on so-called eco-terrorists, and that, in her words, she embodied the past too much in the eyes of others. So based on previous research by others, I expected that the form of repression that respondents had experienced might help make sense of this variation in participation outcomes that I observed. Perhaps those who were arrested and had to deal with the legal system might be more likely to be deterred than those who were pepper sprayed at a protest. Or perhaps covert types of repression, such as infiltration or surveillance, may have more of a chilling effect than more obvious overt repression like violence or arrest. So this table shows the types of repression experienced by the interviewees. The first thing that becomes immediately apparent is that all 4 forms of repression that I focused on were remarkably common amongst those I interviewed. Each of the 4 types of repression were experienced by the majority of the interviewees, with 89% having been arrested, 58% experiencing police violence, 76% being under surveillance or having good reason to believe that they were, and 60% having been part of a group that was infiltrated by an undercover officer or informant. And this table displays the number and percentage of activists who persisted and disengaged among those who experienced each of these 4 types of repression. So, for example, 69% of the 26 respondents who experienced police violence at a protest or other movement related interaction with law enforcement, for example, in the course of interrogation, persisted, while 31% disengaged. Chi-square tests of independence revealed that there was no significant differences in persistence or disengagement between individuals who experienced police violence, surveillance, or infiltration compared with those who had not had each of these experiences. The only significant difference was between those who had been arrested and those who had not, suggesting that arrest may actually help to induce persistence for some. The stories of some respondents like Corey and Angela that I read, the stories that they told about having their eyes opened by personal experience of the criminal justice system might help explain the unique backfire effect of arrest experiences specifically. Also, respondents sometimes talked about arrest as something that was planned as part of an act of civil disobedience, as something that they deliberately volunteered for, whereas this level of intentional choice was much less common with other forms of repression. So this is another reason why experiences with arrest might be especially likely to radicalize or at least not deter activists. But the fact that those who disengaged and those who persisted exhibited indistinguishable rates of the other major types of repression, police violence, surveillance, infiltration, suggests that examining the type of repression experienced only gets us so far in understanding individuals' dramatically different reactions to repression. Given this, perhaps it's not the type of repression that activists experience that makes them more likely to be deterred than others, but rather the severity of these experiences. Repression severity might be a better measure of the costliness of repression than repression type. And if rational choice scholars are right that it's the costliness of repression that gives it its deterrent quality, this might best explain who persisted and who disengaged. Perhaps it's those who shouldered the most significant burdens of repression or who had the most traumatic experiences with the state who were deterred, while those who had relatively minor experiences were not. To test this, all respondents were assigned a severity score measuring the number of severe repression experiences that they had undergone. The scheme for these severity scores was inductively derived from how respondents collectively spoke about different types of repression, different experiences of repression. So the scores range from 0 to 4. On average, respondents had experienced 1.4 severe types of repression. This table displays the average severity scores of respondents who persisted and those who disengaged. Those who disengaged had an average severity score of 1.58. Those who persisted had an average score 1.3. So at first glance, this might suggest that severity of experience might help explain these disparate effects. However, two sample t-tests revealed that there was no statistically significant difference between the mean severity scores of the two groups. So together with the findings about repression type, this suggests that people have very different responses to objectively similar experiences of repression. Because individuals seem to respond so differently to objectively similar costs and risks of repression, this suggests that attention should be turned to the factors that shape the subjective perception and experience of repression. And to this end, my book goes on to explore the social factors that alter this calculus and make some individual activists more resilient in the face of repression than others. So after demonstrating through my respondents' stories that repression can come with many different kinds of costs, direct financial costs, career and educational costs, time costs, emotional and social costs, I show how activist groups work together to mitigate these costs for individuals. They do this by working to prevent the costs of repression. For example, a great deal of effort in activist groups goes into identifying infiltrators, expelling them from the group, and warning others about them. So most respondents told me that one type of infiltrator, undercover officers, were usually fairly easy to spot. Sometimes they were identifiable because there was a clear lack of cultural fit between the undercover officers and the activist group. In this way, one of the strongest defenses that activist groups have against infiltration is having a distinctive, nuanced subculture that is not easy for an outsider to mimic or learn convincingly. From some of the stories I heard, it seemed that undercover officers often failed to do even the most cursory research about the groups that they were trying to infiltrate. For example, Keith told me about how everyone became suspicious of one man because he showed up to a potluck of environmental and animal rights activists with a bucket of Kentucky Fried Chicken. At a potluck where most, if not all, of the people were vegans or at least vegetarians, and guests were expected to bring healthy, home-cooked meals, showing up with a bucket of KFC was a strong tell. Months later, this man conclusively exposed himself when he dropped his police-issue gun during a scuffle at a protest. Other times, undercover officers were obvious to those that I interviewed because they tried too hard to seem like activists. Dana, for example, explained that she could identify undercover officers just by the way that they dressed and their attempt to be like in use language that just didn't come off, like mannerisms that were bad, like they were trying to be cool. Most people I interviewed were more concerned about informants than undercovers, both because they were more able to pull off the act, but also because it constituted a deeper form of betrayal. Informants are individuals who are or were at some point involved in activism themselves, or at least socially tied to activists, who provide information on others in exchange for legal leniency, sometimes on a protest-related charge, but oftentimes on unrelated issues such as drug charges. In many cases, this can mean returning to activist groups or rekindling old friendships while wearing or carrying a listening device. So while remaining vigilant in looking for signs that someone might be an infiltrator can result in guardedness and suspicion within activist groups, this may sometimes be an impediment to mobilization and recruiting new members. In most cases that interviewees discussed, their suspicions were confirmed, often through court proceedings, and they feel strongly that their guardedness has successfully protected themselves and their friends. Groups also do this by working to prepare individuals for the costs of repression. By preparing activists for repression, activist groups help to buffer individuals against the shock of repression. In fact, 4/5 of those who discussed having a repressive experience for which they felt unprepared subsequently disengaged, while only 1/5 of those who did not express having such an experience disengaged. And this difference was statistically significant. When individuals go into a situation without an understanding of the risks or are unprepared for the possibility of repression, and then it does occur, the experience can be far more upsetting than it would have been otherwise. Jessica was a young mother who disengaged from activism following a violent arrest and being placed on the law enforcement watch list. She was deterred after just one, albeit particularly traumatic, experience of state repression. Because she was not well integrated into the community of others involved in the protest, she was completely unprepared for the experience. She explained that there were meetings leading up to the protest where others were helping each other to be prepared for the possibility of police violence and arrest, but that she wasn't part of these meetings and felt more generally like many of the more seasoned activists didn't see her as one of them. Because she was unconnected and unaware of what was being planned or what might be expected, she just showed up to the protest completely unprepared. She was unprepared physically, wearing a tank top and a skirt, which was a tangible reflection of her lack of awareness of the situation, which turned out to be a very uncomfortable mistake when she was later doused in pepper spray and thrown into a cold jail cell. She explained other people were more prepared. A lot of people, had hoodies, like ample clothing on, like bandanas, those little surgical masks that cover your face. People had meetings and they were talking about it. They went together. There were all these people who were like, I'm ready to get arrested. But I wasn't one of those people. I showed up alone. Others who are more socialized into activist culture are less likely to be caught off guard by repression the way that Jessica was. In activist meetings and trainings, there is often discussion about how to respond when police use force against you or arrest you, or how to talk to police, or rather not talk to them to avoid incriminating yourself or others. Sometimes this involved role-playing to mentally prepare oneself for these situations, with some of my respondents going so far as to pepper spray each other so they would understand what it felt like and how to respond before they experienced it at the hands of a police officer at a protest. Groups also work to reduce costs of repression by working to institutionalize systems of legal, medical, and even emotional support for those who experience repression. This is especially important when costs and risks are unpredictable and unevenly distributed, and therefore fall on some individuals more than others, as is often the case with repression. By creating systems in which those who are less directly impacted chip in to relieve some of the burden on those who are more directly impacted, costs are redistributed and shared among the group. When these support networks are strong and functional, this not only has the benefit for those receiving the support and makes it less likely that they will disengage following repression, but this support also builds a sense of solidarity and camaraderie among activists and helps to build stronger movements. I found that individuals who described not receiving the support that they needed during an experience of repression were far more likely to disengage than those who did not express ever having such an experience. While nearly 70% of those who had an experience in which they lacked support disengaged, less than 10% of those who expressed always having the necessary support from others did so. And this difference was highly statistically significant. All three of these ways of mitigating costs of repression are not always evenly distributed within movements. Resources and information flow through activist networks, meaning that those who are better connected are also better protected, prepared, and supported. Poor planning, conflicting interests, and hierarchies and schisms within communities or movements can lead to some individuals feeling disowned or left to fend for themselves, with serious consequences for their continued participation. Groups also influence individuals' response to repression by providing a new lens through which they can understand the risks and rewards of participation in collective action. I discovered this way that group culture can influence individuals' reactions to repression while working to make sense of an unexpected finding. Early in each interview, I asked about times they felt that political campaigns or actions they were involved in achieved something, and about times they felt defeated or ineffectual. My intention was simply to get them talking and telling stories, to warm them up for the harder questions I was going to ask about their experiences with repression. But to my surprise, respondent after respondent found it difficult to point to any successes and had ample stories of failure and moments of defeat and disillusionment to tell me about. Their answers reflected despair much more often than hope. Routinely, they told me things like, ultimately, let's see, my Zoom thing is covering up my slide. Ultimately, we're all losing. Everything, in my opinion, the earth is sunk. Or it seems like the bad guys always win and the shitty laws always get passed. I don't know that any protest I've participated in produced a tangible socio-political effect. Or I'm not an optimistic person. Everything else we always lost, so it's no big deal to lose again. I don't think we can beat them. Like, that's the basic rule. That activists would expend great effort and risk serious consequences despite pessimism about the impact of their actions or the chances for social change is puzzling, considering that much of social movement research assumes that people participate in protest in part because they believe they can have an impact. Perhaps most famously, McAdam, civil rights movement scholar, argues that to mobilize, people must not simply believe that something is unjust, they must believe that it can be changed. As social movement scholars, we also tend to focus on those movements, groups, or protest events that do achieve some level of success. But as my respondent stories make clear, often the aims of specific campaigns or movements are not realized. Despite the concerted efforts of groups of activists, ancient trees are cut down, regressive laws are passed, and wars rage on. In the face of what often feels like a long string of failures punctuated by the occasional success, persisting in activism can feel like walking a thin line between hope and despair. To engage in collective action is not only to put forth effort with no guarantee that it will pay off, it's to invest oneself in an enterprise in which victory is always possible, but rarely probable. As I argue, accepting and even expecting failure, as most of my respondents did, may almost counterintuitively help protect activists from disillusionment and disappointment and encourage commitment in the face of repression. Furthermore, intertwined with these expressions of pessimism, my respondents' discourse also revealed ways that groups help activists to render their participation and their sacrifices meaningful, despite what is often a lack of tangible success. I identified 4 ways that activists I interviewed exhibited this kind of reorientation in thinking about the ends or aims of protest. One was redefining success to include nebulous or process-oriented goals. This could mean focusing on goals like attention, gaining attention, raising awareness, movement, or community building. Sometimes they redefine success to include resistance itself. And this can be seen when respondents would tell me things like the immigrant rights activist who told me, so far the success has been in continuing to struggle in a really unjust world and maintain our humanity. But the laws that get passed seem to be getting worse and worse, so it's hard to claim a lot of victories. And environmental activists explain our victories, I think, were mostly in that we demonstrated a collective tenacity and uncompromising position that went on for years and years. Sometimes they redefine success to include repression itself. So when repression is framed as indicative of the importance or the strength of the movement, it's no longer simply a cost, it's a sign of success. In fact, a full 2/3 of respondents described repression as proof of their efficacy or that of their movement. And finally, sometimes they explicitly resisted the language of efficacy altogether. For example, saying things like, I prefer not to speak in terms of success, or I guess nothing really ever felt like a defeat. A lot of times we didn't reach the goal that we had, but I think that it was always still very possible. Importantly, those who exhibited one or more of these discursive signs of reorientation were more likely to persist in activism despite their experiences of state repression. Finally, protest cultures also provide individuals with a source of identity, and when that activist role identity is particularly salient, participation becomes foundational to one's sense of self and becomes more of a second nature. As this happens, costs and benefits fade into the background, participation becomes less of a conscious choice, and alternative lines of action become increasingly difficult for individuals to imagine. As a result, participation also becomes more resilient to the potential deterrent effects of repression. Therefore, movement culture works to produce commitment in the face of repression, not just by shaping actors' experiences, the costs and benefits, or their motivations, their ends. It also shapes individuals' identities by internalizing social movement participation as a fundamental aspect of self in ways that can make participation feel taken for granted, even especially when it becomes costly. So I consider discourse in which individuals describe their activism as inseparable from their sense of self, as something that they feel compelled or morally obligated to do, or as something that they cannot or could not imagine not doing, as evidence of a salient activist identity. As an example of this first type of discourse, Brad said of his efforts in starting and running an info shop, a community center that provides political literature and other resources to a community, and a space for activist meetings and events. It was my entire identity. Like, that's who I was when I was doing that. It was so a part of my identity that when the info shop failed, I failed. In reality, I should have separated my personal success and failure from the project or organization I was a part of, but that's how deeply engrossed I was in what was going on. An example of this second type is when one respondent told me, "It's like I don't have a choice. I feel a calling, like this is my life's work. This is what I should be doing. It's like compulsion." Finally, an example of the third, one told me after finding out that her close friend and fellow activist was under surveillance, that this didn't cause her to reconsider her involvement. She attempted to explain why. I don't know why. I guess that it probably should have. But maybe my brain was protecting me because I think that at that time, that was my life. Getting out, I just couldn't even think of it. Others simply asked, "What else would I do at this point?" Or explained, "I guess I don't know what else there is to do." Of those whose narrative of self indicated that they had at some point or currently had taken on a salient activist role identity, which was about 53% of the sample, nearly 90% have persisted. Of those who do not talk about their past or present selves in this way, 47% of the sample, only about half have persisted after experiencing state repression. And this difference was statistically significant. So together, these findings demonstrate the importance of these three factors: preparation and support, alternative conceptions of the ends of collective action, and a salient activist role identity for explaining who persists and who disengages following experiences of repression. Combined with the findings discussed earlier, showing that repression type and severity do little to explain variation in responses to repression, this points to the importance of the subjective experience of repression and furthermore, the power of group culture in shaping this. Both insights have been largely neglected in previous research on the effects of state repression, which has tended to look to features of the repression itself to explain its heterogeneous effects, and which has underestimated the degree to which individual rationality is malleable and collectively constructed. By demonstrating how individuals' experience of and decision-making about repression are influenced by the activist cultures in which they participate, I provide a new angle for making sense of the mixed findings on repression effects that have been identified in previous studies. And by focusing on how activist collectivities construct rationality for individual members and work to make groups more repression resistant, I also help to bridge a significant divide in research on social movements. Research on repression is often criticized for being overly invested in rational choice thinking, viewing repression as working to raise the cost of participation, and neglecting the importance of emotional and cultural group dynamics. Meanwhile, the literature on cultural and emotional dynamics of social movements is often criticized for failing to show in concrete ways how culture actually works in movement practice and discourse. By focusing on specific mechanisms by which group culture shapes how individuals think about the risks and rewards of repression and participation, I work to overcome shortcomings in both areas and bring them into dialogue with one another. I not only provide new traction on this longstanding puzzle over the consequences of repression for social movements, but in doing so also bring to the fore the agency that movements have in shaping these consequences. This agency is often most clear when these ways through which groups can buffer individuals from the deterrent effects of repression fail. When individuals are not well integrated into communities of activists, they sometimes lack adequate preparation, both physical and mental, for these experiences and are more likely to subsequently disengage from activism as a result. Perhaps even more consequently, when individuals lack the support they need, and especially when they feel criticized rather than supported by other activists following a repressive incident, they're much more likely to distance themselves from further involvement. Furthermore, when individuals are not socialized into thinking about the meaningfulness of their efforts in more expansive and expressive terms, and instead measure their efforts in terms of more narrow concepts of efficacy, they may be more likely to burn out when immediate success proves lacking, especially when this absence of reward is coupled with the high costs that can come with state repression. Finally, when individuals lack a salient activist role identity, they are less likely to persist following repression, in part because they may be more vulnerable to reconsidering their behavior when faced with the increased costs posed by repression. These failures to prevent deterrence following repression provide important lessons to activist organizations and communities on how best to build cultures of resistance and resilience, which is something I think we can all agree we need right now more than ever. So thank you, and I welcome your questions.
So, Heidi, I have two questions for you. Let me throw these out here. One, why did you get interested in studying this? And two, how do you think what you've come to understand can apply to what's happening in our society today?
Okay, those are great, big questions. So first off, my interest in this as a scholar definitely grew out of my own personal experiences as an activist. So it's something important to put out there from the start. I had some pretty formative experiences early on. In college, I really became involved in political activism from a young age. I'm child of activist parents, so I kind of grew up in that culture. Was involved, as soon as basically I was 14, I became involved in a lot of things. And then in college, I had an experience at the Free Trade Area of the Americas protests in Miami, so 2004, where the response from police against the protests was particularly aggressive. And it was really a departure from the tone of protests that it had occurred in previous years. And so it was in that way sort of a shock to many there. And I came away from that experience feeling this tension between, in many ways, feeling radicalized and outraged by what I saw. And really, I think that experience changed the way that I saw my country, the state, in ways that probably also really shaped the trajectory of my interests in sociology and Inside Out and all of this stuff that I've since become involved in. And so in that way, it was very much a radicalizing experience. It also was a terrifying experience. And I also felt this pull to want to avoid situations where I would be in danger in that way. I saw many people around me hurt very badly, saw people arrested, and that was just the more, I guess, at that point, one of the more extreme circumstances I had seen. But this was at a time when I was going to a lot of protests, was arrested at some other protests. So I had a variety of experiences during that time that I could see just in myself the potential for both of these effects. And I could see that in my friends and people around me. I saw people who were deterred by these experiences, and I saw people who just got more and more committed. And so that question was in the back of my mind even before I knew that that was a question that social movement scholars were talking about. And so later, when I was in graduate school and I was kind of finding my place and what within sociology I wanted to study, I really didn't actually think I wanted to focus on social movements at all. I was interested primarily in mass incarceration and impacts on families. But over the course of, different classes and meeting different mentors in graduate school, I started to become more interested in social movements and specifically the policing and repression side of movements. And so when I came across this unsettled question that there'd been so much research on about, does repression deter and have a chilling effect, or does it backfire and cause more mobilization? To me, it was a, inherently interesting, important question, and I could see the tension in it just from my own observations and experiences. And so, and then as I read more and more in that literature, I was surprised that there was so little focus on the activist side of it and what activists were doing to try to shape what effect repression had on their movements. And there was so much emphasis just on, well, when the state does this or they do it at this point, then that is going to deter versus it's going to backfire. And so I really wanted to focus on that agency and sort of cultural dynamics of that. And as I mentioned before, too, a lot of that literature was focused on this rational choice way of thinking about how people make decisions. And I suspected that there was a lot more happening at the group level in terms of how, culture and identity might shape the way people are thinking about their actions that are not in strictly rational terms. And so that was another aspect of it that I was interested in. So, so this was my dissertation project in graduate school, then later became my first book. So that's your first question. Should I go on to your second question, or if the hands are raised or related to?
Okay.
Okay.
Go with the other folks.
Okay. So I think Sergio, you maybe had your hand up first, and then Susan.
Yeah. Thank you for your presentation. Super interesting. And I want to ask you, what do you think that can the social movement theory can tell us about the self-organization of people in prison that sometimes try to do some strikes, some I see trade union in prison of people in prison that try to defend their rights when there are like very abusive prison system. And what do you think that this kind of repression that is inside the prison, how is work? And because we have a time when there was a lot of social movement of people in prison, and then the repression in many spaces was so strong that basically it was defeated all, and then I feel like some form of resistance with the family member of the people outside, that in some sort they can do more, have more agency to do more, that they should get less repressed and so on. Then I want to ask you if there are some reflection about the very peculiar situation that the people that we work with have to face inside this regional space that is not necessarily very democratic.
Yeah, that's a really good point, because obviously it's a context in which all of these dynamics we're talking about are like amplified, right? I mean, the control is just so much stronger from the get-go, let alone the repressive response to any kind of collective action. You bring up a good point. There has not been as much of that kind of collective action recently than we've seen in the past. But I think there's also ways that it happens in smaller, less perceived ways as well. Like I've just in my own experience teaching Inside Out, I've heard stories from the inside students about experiences where, one of the people on their work crew was going to be denied a family visit that they were expecting and really looking forward to on some kind of technicality. And everybody said, we're not going to work today until she can see her family today. And they and it worked in this very small kind of way. And so even in this very repressive, controlled environment. So I think, yeah, it's not something that is completely out of the question or cannot happen, but obviously the risks are higher and the level of control is higher. So I don't know if that really gets at your question, but yeah, it's definitely a difficult question, and something that I haven't specifically focused my research on, but have noticed in my Inside Out teaching that there is still there are still ways to do that, but it can be more difficult for sure. Susan?
Hi. So first, just a comment. I mean, my experience with being on the edge goes back to anti-war stuff.
Mhm.
And I think we were amazingly naive at that point about the consequences and what was happening in different places. But I've always thought that part of what keeps me and a lot of people going out there is that community. And I think that that's a hugely powerful piece of, that it forms part of who you are. And so it was interesting to see how that worked out. What I'm wondering is if you looked at all at demographics.
Sorry, did you say that again?
Demographics.
Yeah.
Look at
So,
all the
sure.
ages and how that
Yeah.
impacted it.
I wish I had the table up. Let me see. I've got it it's in the appendix of my book, so I can pull it up pretty quickly, I think. But basically, the group that I interviewed was very wide variety in terms of ages. So my oldest respondent being in her late 80s, and then some of the younger respondents, several that were in their early 20s. No one under 18, but that was just a matter of IRB and that kind of thing. Of course, there are people who are involved that young, and so many of them. The average age was like, I believe, in 40s. Many of them had been involved for a few decades, at least by the point that I was interviewing them. So they had a lot of experiences of activism and repression to share. In terms of race, the group that I interviewed did skew more white. And so they, compared to the population in Arizona, and many people talked about this as something where they felt some of that compulsion, that they felt that feeling of needing to do this was because of their awareness of their privilege. And many of them, many worked on immigrant rights issues and knew that their privilege as white citizens really gave them an opportunity to be able to assist undocumented neighbors. And so they felt that was a big part of their motivation and compulsion to do so and to take the risks that they did, because they knew that the risks that they were taking weren't as great as the risks others were taking. And so they felt like an obligation to do that. But that certainly wasn't the case with everyone. There was a few interview respondents who I talked to who were themselves undocumented immigrants who were where part of their calculus and sort of coming to this was the realization or the awareness that they were at risk of repression even if they didn't get involved politically. When SB 1070, the law in Arizona, the Show Me Your Papers law, was passed, for many people that was sort of a breaking point. They realized, I could get picked up and deported while going to school or going to work or doing everything right, And so when they got to that point where they realized that, then they felt like, well, what's the additional risk of going to a protest? And if anything, there's more danger or more risk of not doing anything to try to fight this. And so I remember one of the just most moving interviews I did was with a young woman in this situation, her talking about this and how her mother, who was also undocumented, was, begging her not to go to this protest, was worried that she'd be arrested and deported. And then when she wasn't, she actually was arrested, but not deported. After that, her mom said, actually, can I come to the next protest with you? And then everyone in their families just started to just be feel a lot more brave and bold and willing to stand up for their rights and rights of others in their family. And, it's really great to see how finding that community of other people who were fighting alongside them gave them a sense of courage that they had not had in their lives before being a part of that movement. And so, yeah. So there was a mix in terms of that, but definitely a somewhat more privileged group. All slightly more males and females in the sample of interviews, but not by a lot.
Interesting. Thank you.
Yeah. And some of this was also related to, like, there's a lot of studies that show whatever seed sample you start with, that's going to, your final sample is going to have a similar complexion to it in these various ways. And that was the case. The seed sample, this law enforcement watch list, was slightly more male and more white than non-white.
So let's go back to my second question then. How do you, given the situation that we're in and, all of the activity on the streets throughout the country, all sorts of activities, all sorts of protests, demonstrations, etc. I don't even know what the question is, but how do you understand what's happening? Just your thoughts about it.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, I think that many of the dynamics that I'm talking about here are just coming out even more in relief now. So it's like, I was studying this at a time, like I was talking about, where there had been this sort of ramping up of the repressive capacity of the state and the repressive activity of the state following 9/11. And so I think we're now in the midst of an accelerated version of that kind of ramping up again. I think that these ways that groups can work to support each other, to work to protect each other, and to stay strong and committed through those fears of repression and even actual experiences of repression is just going to be that much more important now than ever. I think that at least within the activist groups that I'm a part of and the circles I'm a part of, I see that a lot of people they're looking to the past experiences of repression, as well as in other countries, and in trying to learn these lessons and prepare with all of that in mind. And so I think these conversations about how we can make sure that we have a strong and functional legal support system and medical support, like street medics at protests, all those kinds of things, as that repression is ramping up, so is that response and that resistance on the side of activists. And so that gives me a lot of hope. I also know that this is going to be a very difficult period, no matter what. But I do have hope in seeing that level of like response and preparation and resistance from activists.
Do you have any comments on the indivisible movement?
Some of the groups that I've been involved in here have been loosely tied with that, or in some of the protests, like, the hands-off protests. I've tended, we had larger protests that here in Pueblo than anything I've seen since I've lived in Pueblo, smaller city with not nearly as big of a sort of movement community as other places that I've lived. And so it was great to see that response. I'm not, as far as like as an organization, I'm not like that familiar or connected with Indivisible, but I do know that they've been active here and elsewhere.
So I have one other question, which is, given that, so it's been 100 and whatever days now, and there have been these ongoing protests every day, or another, if not many places. Just from your study of this, do you anticipate that will continue, or that it will start to wane, or that it will continue to grow? I mean, what's your sense of that?
My sense is that if a repressive response and crackdown on protest continues, then there will be more of that backfire effect and larger and larger movements. I think that there is so much support for the resistance right now, not even just those who are actually participating in it, but others as well. And there's just such a heightened sort of alarm from so many people that I think that the response will be overwhelming if there were to be a sort of escalation on the side of the state in terms of repression. And I think that those support networks are strong, that preparation for, how to respond if you're arrested or what to do in those kinds of situations. That I think it is strong and prepared to respond.
Mhm, mhm.
Yes, Susan.
And the numbers always go up in the summer.
Yes, that's true too. We're in for a hot summer, as some people say. Yeah. Yeah. Yep. Yep.
Any other thoughts or questions from anybody?
One other thing I'll mention is that, not all protests is like street protests that we think of first and foremost, and that turns out those big numbers. There's also a lot happening right now, and I know this isn't news to anybody, but there's a lot happening right now that is, in the vein of providing direct action and rapid response to protect immigrants. So, like, that's another thing that I've been taking a lot of hope from seeing. It's how much organizing is happening even in smaller cities like where I live, for people to be organized and trained to observe and document situations where there's ICE raids or any kind of ICE activity, to try to get know your rights information out to people so that communities are organized and know not to open their door to ICE. And there's so much, obviously there's a lot to be concerned about right there in that area right now, but there's also so much happening to try to protect and rally around those neighbors. So that gives me hope.
And from what you observe, where are young people in relation to these protests? Young meaning college age, maybe young 20s.
Well, we definitely saw that, in the last couple of years, so much of the protest around Palestine, genocide in Palestine, was happening at college campuses, young people. So I think, in every era, young people are at the forefront often of movements, and that hasn't changed. I know that sometimes there can be concern that if in a particular generation, maybe protest looks different than it did before. People worry, oh, it's online, it's not the same as it used to be. But I think we can look to the recent protests on college campuses and that are happening right now around Palestine and around against the Trump administration generally. To see that the student movement is still alive and well and will always be an integral part of the resistance, I think.
Other thoughts? Anyone? I think this was very interesting. I appreciate, yeah, I appreciate the depth within which the depth you went into. So, okay, let's get out there, get out on the streets and do this. Okay, well,
Thank you, Paul.
Heidi, thank you so much, and thank you all for coming.
Thank you. That was great. Thanks.
Thank you.
Alrighty, take care.
Bye.
And wait a minute. Oh, okay.